Hey guys, it's Talarius. It's been a few months since we've spoken, most likely. Took like a 6 to 7 month break. Of course I never uploaded, unfortunately, kind of left you guys in the dust. But I was hoping to return mainly to WoW, to some changes to PvP, mainly World PvP, Arena, or even dueling, doesn't really matter what, I'd be satisfied with anything. This is going to be a really long video, most likely, as I actually wrote out an entire script that I'm going to be using as a baseline, but not just directly reading it like from a book. Just to kind of refresh my memory of all the ideas I have for this video as I go through them, to really articulate all of them towards you guys and see what you have to say about the current state of the skill cap in PvP. So let's just jump right into it. The skill cap problem in WoW. As years have gone on in WoW, everyone has essentially noticed that there's been a massively diminishing return going on in a deeper level of WoW's mechanical PvP. So like mechanical meaning the raw buttons you're pressing, the combos, the finger memory, the overall abilities, where they seem to peak in Cataclysm in terms of overall number. They've been heavily slashed away, starting during Mists of Pandaria, going all the way through to Legion, so like Moad then Legion. And of course the worst of them, currently at least, is Legion. These mechanics have gotten easier as time has gone on, as more abilities are removed from the game. Alright, just more and more are constantly being removed. Zaryu actually brought up a great point in a video I've recently watched with him doing a video for Method, and it's a point that I've shared since Worlds of Draenor. As soon as WoD came out, I was talking about this to my friends, my fellow PvP buddies.
Enjoyable, such as rebuffing. Rebuffing might seem something so small or so little, 10% increase intellect, like who cares, Zaryu, you're crazy. But being able to, a good player being able to realize, oh, I got purged, let me rebuff, versus a player less experienced not being able to see that they got purged and their arcane intellect isn't up anymore and they forget to rebuff. Well, now that just added a skill gap. That just added 10% different stats on your intellect just from the guy that remembered to rebuff. That skill gap, I'm really looking forward to seeing back into.
As you can see, he actually mentions buffing, right? So, and you think buffing, who cares? Well, that's a skill cap, right? It's a small skill cap, but it's a skill cap. So a below average player and an average player, after they wouldn't even notice that they were purged and their buffs were gone, right? Or a below average to average player wouldn't be purging an enemy, right? Because they didn't think you'd get much value out of it. Essentially what would happen is a good player would rebuff, and as time went on, that extra mastery, that extra crit, that extra 5% agility would add up, and you'd get ahead in damage or healing because of it. And it did make a large difference overall, right? So that's why rebuffing was super important back then. It would also protect more powerful buffs. So like if I were to give my mage Kings and Might, and someone was trying to purge their icy veins, they'd have to go through 2 buffs to get to that icy veins. That's just one skill cap issue, that when you remove it, nobody has to do it anymore, so the skill ball lowers. One argument I tend to see with what I talk about is the overall number of buttons being an issue, and they say, well, the game wasn't meant for the need of a gaming mouse. And what I say to that is you never needed a gaming mouse in the first place. It was always a luxury item. An example being I got my first 2200 and 2400 Cataclysm, then Mop, without a gaming mouse, whereas people were crying for one. And how I did this was actually by using Shift-Alt macros. So essentially what that means is if I pressed 1, it would do my Crusader Strike. If I held Shift and 1, it would do my Judgment. As an example, those aren't my exact binds, but it's an example. So essentially you could double up, say your main 5 buttons, 1 through 5 or 6, if you have big dick hands, or Shift R, for instance, was my focus kick, stuff like that. Or Shift 4 would be my, you pressed it normally, you would cast your hammer resistance on your target. If you held Shift and press it, it would cast it on your off target. So those kind of buttons were very easily manageable and extremely quick to get used to, actually. In my opinion, you never needed a Razer Naga or a Logitech regardless, and I still don't use one to this day, especially since Legion has gotten so much easier than prior expansions. You don't need it anymore, right? there's not even enough buttons to fill 2 action bars. So over time, essentially, I strive to be better, so I used those macros, and it was really easy to learn how to do too. Like there's so many guides on it. So try and keep in mind that I'm not trying to debate which expansion was the most balanced overall, because I just talked about Mists of Pandaria, and like I talked about Legion just now too, about how kind of easy it is, but I'm trying to talk about the raw mechanical skill each expansion had over one another. And Mists of Pandaria, most classes held onto quite a few unique abilities and a lot of abilities that were deemed useless by lower to average tier players. A good example of these being Turn Evil, from a paladin, hibernate from a druid, scare beast from a hunter. These are just a few, but most classes at least had 1 to 2, and each were designed and used by every best player in the world. Vanguards for Rets, you know, you see Watch Soda pop into it. They all use the Turn Evil glyph, an example, made it instant cast, and these abilities were used in a manner low average players simply wouldn't see the point of, right? Or think it was a waste of a global, so they'd prioritize doing other things. They'd prioritize casting another Templar Verdict over rebuffing and casting a Turn Evil. They want that extra damage over that extra potential that the buffs and the Turn Evil give. However, experienced players would use these abilities to the point of perfection. Typically, you know, like a Paladin would Turn Evil and a Holy Death Knight's Gargoyle, and a transformed pet to avoid a stun and overall damage. Or Turn Evil a Shadow Priest Aberrations, their Psy Fiend, or a DK after they use a Lichborn on themselves, right, incorrectly with, you know, so essentially it was a mind game. So if you're fighting a Death Knight as a Paladin, they use Lichborn, you Turn Evil in. They'd waste the entire cooldown, right, because it was 8-second cooldown. They'd be trying to death coil themselves while undead, but you just Turn Evil them and make them waste the cooldown, so you'd get ahead. You would be using a 15-second cooldown to get rid of their 2-minute long cooldown, right? And that's a huge advantage of momentum, right? That self-heal is gone from them, and you barely had to use anything. So that's the value game of skill that used to happen in World of Warcraft. However, a Death Knight had the ability to counter this, and how they would do it is they pop Lichborn, right, of course, and they would AMS at the same time. So the AMS would protect them from a Turn Evil from a Paladin, and it would also let them heal and generate runic power extremely quickly because of it. So a good Death Knight would always do that, or they would do so behind a pillar, or, you know, my point being is there was outplay potential on both sides. If one made a mistake, the other could capitalize on it, and if one didn't make a mistake, they were still using AMS, they were still using 2 defensives at the same time. So it's a value game. And the same concept can be seen with other abilities such as Hibernate, which is one of my favorite things to watch. Watching 2 experienced Pharaohs fight 1v1, you know, is a mind game, you know. So let's imagine 2 Pharaohs fighting in a misdefend area. If one Pharaoh wasn't beating the other one, then you knew he was going to Hibernate you as a good player, right? Because that good player was going to use Hibernate, because Hibernate would break off bleed. So that Pharaoh would be using blunt damage like a Ferocious Bites, you know, and Maul and stuff that wouldn't bleed the target, so they could get a Hibernate, get damage out, and that Hibernate would lead into a full clone, and that clone would give them a full re-stealth, that they'd pounce the target and then bleed them, right? However, there was counterplay to that combo as well, where the opposing Druid, after seeing they weren't being bled, would actually leave form after they saw the enemy got their 5-cast instant cast proc off their Ferocious Bites, until that buff fell off. So they couldn't Hibernate them because they were in a normal form. They weren't in an animal form, right? So Hibernate only worked against animals, or bestial forms, or whatever the fuck it says. A good example, I recommend you watching some Misapendary Soda Poppin' VODs, him fighting against rank 1 Pharaohs. It's incredibly intense, the amount of mind games and skill you have to put into those fights. And then you put 2 average Pharaohs up against the 100 that are like 2k rated or 1600. I'm not being elitist here, it's just a generalization. There are some really good 2k players, and they just didn't do that. Neither of them would. They didn't even have Hibernate on their bars, probably, you know. They would never use the ability once in their life. So essentially there was a big mind game and skill gap where that rank 1 Pharaoh, if they fought one of those average players, not only would they be better mechanically DPS wise, but they would be able to abuse that strategy against the enemy and absolutely annihilate, right? Just from this one underused small ability, because of the overall value you got from it in the end. Another instance of a large skill gap during MoP regarding one ability was Hunters. So Scare Beast, which is arguably one of the most niche abilities, right? It was more niche than Hibernate and more niche than Turn Evil. But so essentially it was only good against Hunters and Druids. But any good Hunter would be abusing this effect, where the exact same scenario would happen between a Druid versus a Hunter. A Druid would be constantly hibernating a Hunter's pet to avoid CC and the damage from the pet, especially if they were BM. And the Hunter would be constantly casting Scare Beast when they got the chance to force the Druid out of form, right? Fear them, top of that, get them in a full trap, do their whole setup, and burst them down, right? However, Pharaohs countered Hunters. But if they could get this off, it was a massive advantage. Whereas an average Pharaoh would get dumpstered even though they countered Hunters during the expansion. A good Hunter would be able to outplay it. Again, Druids had the opportunity to avoid this by leaving form at the end of the Scare Beast cast. Not only would the Hunter be wasting their time by casting it right, but the Druid would leave form so it wouldn't affect them. They'd re-enter form once they finish and get some damage out again. So there's a constant back and forth. Of course, because the Druid left form, he's more vulnerable temporarily to like the Hunter's pet damage because he loses that armor from being in cat form. So it was a constant back and forth mind game battle. A feral who didn't know leaving form was useful would typically be just absolutely annihilated, and the vice versa as well if the hunter never used Scare Beast versus a feral. A hunter could even use Scare Beast while deterred, right? So you could cast it even though you can't do damage while you're doing deterrence. You could cast Scare Beast. There's a constant growing skill cap between the two classes, just like in the previous scenarios, but years later, they simply removed those abilities. So these clashes of mind game and skill were just completely deleted, right? And I'm like not enough players were using them is what they said essentially, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's near identical to what was said in the Q&A in 2015. And what effect did just deleting them have? Well, all of a sudden the players who took the time to learn to use these abilities and get good at these mind games and these skill caps and these extra value abilities got really good at using them, were all of a sudden taken down a step towards the players who never used them and just didn't care about them. So they just simply didn't have to worry about an extra set of skills any longer. Of course, the player who's living in ignorance about learning the game and becoming truly good doesn't really care. They probably didn't even have it on their bars in the first place, right? Typically. But the player who took the time to do so now all of a sudden felt like their effort was misplaced. That's how I felt. That's how Thyras felt. I don't know if that's how Zaryu felt. I haven't asked him. You know, he probably wouldn't even respond to me anyways. He doesn't love me. But their individual skill output was diminished, and they had to focus their skills on other senses in Arena, which typically would just be damage. Another problem with Mop was going into WoD was the pruning of abilities, right? So Mists of Pandaria had plenty of abilities, but these were pruned in Worlds of Draenor, quite a few of them, 5 to 10 abilities per class. And many classes were oversimplified or abilities were completely removed whatsoever, dumbing down the classes overall or limiting the individual who played them into a specific playstyle. So like Rets, Rogues, most classes in general. Rogues felt fine. Demolocks got hit really hard, right? Probably being the worst of them all, like Carrions, Swarm, Shamans, you get the idea. Classes were simplified, but it was still complicated enough mechanically to enjoy it if you used the right talents. A good example being Empowered Seals on a Ret Paladin. Ret with the improved Templar's Verdict talent, I can't remember what it was called, but Ret with that ability, like Templar's Edict or whatever, with that simplified kit, it felt really basic and boring. But if as soon as you spec Empowered Seals, you were rotating through 4 seals to get different buffs and constantly maintaining them throughout the battle, all of a sudden you felt very fun and complicated. You know, it was a skillful, it was like stance dancing, right? It was a skillful talent that took quite a bit of practice to get used to, but you could probably beat most players 1v1 with it once you got. A lot of classes had their mobility dashed, and a lot of players were quitting not only because of lack of content, but also the lack of complexity. Thyras, my boy Thyras, he's not actually my boy, but he was one of my favorite YouTubers back in Mists of Pandaria. His class was absolutely demolished. It used to have such a high skill cap boomkins, and it was just pruned into a skeleton. So let's hop into Legion now. Legion hit the pruning game even harder with all the class rework. So essentially, they prioritize class fantasy over raw mechanics in the game, right? So they started to really take away abilities. Whereas before in WoD I could fill like 2.5 action bars full of buttons. Now all of a sudden I could only fill around maximum like 1.5, and to the point where my bars felt so empty in Legion on every class that I played that I actually had to take every ability and put it twice beside one another just as a pointless button to make my bars look cleaner and not so empty, because it was a weird feeling to have them completely empty, half of them gone. Hybridization was right, whereas like a Ret used to be able to execution sentence to heal. That was a skill cap too. Having the choice is what makes skill cap. Having the choice to use execution sentence to heal or to do damage. So which one are you going to get more value out of? You have to think on the spot. Do I want to heal and try to outpace their overall damage with healing, or do I want to try to just beat them down before I can die, right? You have to make these subtle choices. Just like how you used to have to make the choice. Again, I'm going to use Ret Pally as an example because I'm experienced with it. Being a gladiator on it, right? I've been 25, 70 or something like that in WoD on my Pally. You have to make the choice between spending your holy power to heal versus damage, to port versus going all in. You know, and these subtle choices made the difference between a good Pally and a bad, whereas a good one would be able to, they wouldn't just be tossing up damage the whole time, they would know the times when to heal. It came with experience. Essentially what's left in Legion, in my opinion, is the core of each class. I'm not talking new classes, but the core of a class is what's left in Legion. Just the skeleton, just the basic abilities you have. You have very few cooldowns overall, very few niche. There are essentially no niche abilities like there used to be, no matter how you slice it. Another argument I say is, well, classes used to be identical before. Well, they didn't really. Every single class was completely different. You couldn't compare a Warlock to a Mage, really. They were totally different. They didn't, you know, like they had Horrifies and Fears. The same things they have now. All that they've done now essentially is add an animation to currently existing spells to make them different and renamed throughout the specs. Classes were already always different. Every spec was individual. You know, before people would talk, oh yeah, I play Demo a lot. You know, it was just completely a different playstyle. Nobody ever said they were the same in the first place. A lot of classes had similar CCs, for example. You know, like Hex and Polymorph, but those still exist in the game. You know, Sap and Poly, Incapacitates, whatever you try and bring out. The class individuality hasn't really changed through Legion. It's just flashier and simplified, is what I'm trying to say. But that point might not be as strong as I think it is, so it felt like an unnecessary change overall. And the skill cap was hit hard. You know, like my favorite YouTuber, Thyraz, like he would go crazy. He'd be feral charging onto ledges with mushrooms, and 90% of good boomkins didn't even use feral charge. They all used Displacer Beast, right? But a good boomkin was using feral charge. They put a mushroom up on the ledge in Blade's Edge Arena, right? And then he'd feral charge up to it. He'd leave boomkin form, go into human form, feral charge up to it, re-enter boomkin form, and just do some crazy stuff like that. There was so much potential to it as a really good boomkin player. And of course he would time his clones properly and all that kind of stuff. There was so much more skill overall and cap to that skill, whereas now the bar is far lower. You know, unfortunately Thyraz essentially quit the game because he wasn't feeling rewarded anymore, and it's how I felt as well. I didn't feel like I was feeling rewarded. I feel like the game was so simplified that it rewarded stupid play overall, and that to have to focus not so much on my mechanical skill, on everything on situational awareness, which is what I had done before, it just felt so much more, like I've said this a million times, but simple, right? And that's what it's become. So I tried so many classes in Legion, and none of them I really enjoyed. I used to love Repelli so much, but it had changed so much in comparison to what it used to be from its mobility. It never had the best mobility, but it had okay mobility. Its mobility mainly to its animations. I think Horsey is really dumb, the speed increase horse. It just looks stupid to me, my opinion. But, you know, to its mechanics, and that can be said for almost every class in Legion, where they've lost everything they used to have, and it's just the bare bones. You used to be able to toss some big off heals, as I said prior. With their niche abilities, you can maximize for value. Let's say you were playing 2v2 as double DPS, right? As a paladin. This is another skill cap issue. So, and you used in WoD, you had used to have 2 stacks of Hand of Sacrifice, so you could be lenient with one. And like, oh, their mage is going to CC me and try to kill my rogue DPS. Well, I would Hand of Sacrifice the rogue, so the damage is redirected to me, and that would break me out of CCs. Now, an average paladin wouldn't do this. They wouldn't pre-sank a CC, or an Incapacitate, a Blind, a Polymorph, a Hex. They would just take it and trinket. However, if I don't have to use that trinket, and I can just use my Hand of Sacrifice, of course I'm going to get ahead in that game. Right? Those small little choices made a huge difference. A lot of players essentially feel like their input isn't during arena. It isn't satisfying anymore for them, and nearly everyone is essentially doing the same boring things over and over. This Skillcap was also affected by the removal of customization in the way of gems and reforging. I'm going to use Paladin as the baseline for most of these points, just to get the point across, but don't take it too critically on Paladin in specific. This applies to most classes. So a good example was with reforging and gems. Seems tedious, but it really wasn't. It was just a bit of a gold sink. You know, toss some gold into the auction house, get some gems, or farm them yourself. So some paladins used to go pure PvP power, pure PvP resilience. Some would go pure strength. You'd go resilience to be tankier. You'd go PvP power to do more burst and somewhat healing. You'd go strength to just do raw overall damage and healing. Vanguards went pure strength and with a bit of haste. And myself, I went crit haste, which seems unorthodox, right? With a few strength gems tossed in there. But I had way higher burst potential and quicker cast times on my heals because of it. And I really like that supporty rule of Ret. And I played this up to 2500. You know, like it was my own specific build that I customized for, but it had a great high burst potential, really high healing potential as well, right? Bursty heals, bursty DPS. Survive and do a lot of burst damage, but my sustained lacked because of it. There were other Rets running completely different self-made builds as well, you know, like completely different. You know, there was like 4 Rets. One of them was running PvP, resilience, and strength because he wanted to be tankier because he was always the kill target, and he needed to be able to take that extra damage. You know, there's so many different builds that took skill to really realize the potential of, and everyone had, because of that difference between individuals, between players, everyone had their own playstyle. Whereas now it's very narrow, and in my opinion, that skill gap is very important in MMO. Now that it's over, so I'm gonna try and end the video, and I'm gonna be remember to edit all this fucking shit, Cage. So now that I've gone over it, over most things over the years, with a few examples, I'm not sure if I properly articulated most of it, but I really did my best job. But I'm gonna offer some, instead of just complaining, I'm gonna try to offer some fixes for these issues. The number one fix is a simple fix: is add new abilities or bring back the majority of old ones, not the huge ones, but the niche one, which will immediately increase the mechanical skill gap in the game, but it also widens the margins of players who will use it and also widens the margins of players who won't use it. As I guarantee in competitive games, people use anything to their advantage when they're good, right? So they will use these small abilities, they always have. Number two is stop taking abilities away. Don't take and tweak, don't remove. The removal of so many core class abilities in the form of artifact abilities is a step in the wrong direction, as another example. Unless Blizzard, what I stated in number one, it only prunes the classes farther. In BFA, they've done the same thing they've done in the last two expansions, where they take one of your baseline abilities and they put it on a talent tree and make you choose of one of three abilities that you already used to have baseline, right? So essentially you get 1/3 of the abilities you used to have, because you just get, oh hey, did you used to love this ability and this ability and this ability? Well, now you get to choose one of them, and the other two you'll never get to use unless you spec for it. But you'll never get what you used to have back, which is a system I really dislike. It really makes it feel like the game is simplifying and that you just don't have as many options as you used to. So it's really not that much of a complicated fix, at least in a fundamental way. None of these abilities that broke the game when they were around for years, they never made it overpowered or anything when they were around, so they won't break it when they're returned. Do you guys remember the days when you'd look forward in X-Pack, you'd scan through your spell book, like, you'd be like, oh shit, you'd be flipping through it, oh, what fucking new abilities do I have in here, motherfucker? Oh my god, at level 87 I get Avatar, and you just shit your pants right there, and you can't wait to get that level to use your new spell. I want those days back. You know, that was really fun. You know, just getting new spells every expansion and be like, holy shit. I understand over years and years there's gonna be way too many, but you get the point, right? And if you guys have any questions or objections, whether you disliked it or if you just want to shit on me in this video because it was shittily made, go ahead. Whether you agree or disagree. And just before I leave, what abilities do you guys miss the most? And you know, rock on, hunters.
And tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom!